Thank you so much for joining us today. We have a very interesting topic. It's one that is very important to our industry. We are always striving to reduce accidents, and the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board, has gone to great lengths over the years to investigate accidents and make recommendations to make flying safer. And today we are grateful that two of the members of the board have joined us. And so we look forward to a very interesting presentation today. We'll start with the people who are joining us today. As always, we have President and CEO of HAI, Jim Viola, who will be joining. And we have the Honorable Bruce Lansberg, who is the Vice Chair of the National Transportation Safety Board. Joining him is Honorable Bruce Lansberg, one of the members of the National Transportation Safety Board. And coming in towards the end of the webinar for the membership or the viewer Q&A is Chris Hill, who is the Director of Safety for HAI. Our webinars are interactive. We do ask that you participate. If you have questions, please use the question module in the bottom or the side of the Zoom screen. Please don't use the chat to ask questions. We're not always able to monitor everything that's going on in there. So please use the question module, and we'll get to those, as many of those as we can at the end of the webinar. As always, this webinar is being recorded. The recording will be available as soon as possible after the webinar is completed. We will get it posted to our website and to our YouTube channel either tomorrow or Monday at the latest. But we do appreciate your patience. We also ask that you share the video if you found it informative and you think other people will be interested in seeing it. At this point, I'd like to introduce Jim Viola, who's the President and CEO of HAI, to join us.
Well, thanks, Dan. I think you might have to give Member Graham an apology. You made him look a lot like Bruce Lansberg on the introductions there. So I'd like to introduce. Go ahead.
Forgot to change the picture, did I?
Yes, you did. So short bios for both. We got Vice Chairman Bruce Lansberg, was sworn in as the Vice Chairman of the NTSB in 2018. He previously served as the President of Aircraft Owner and Pilots Association Foundation and the Air Safety Institute, where I certainly worked with them pretty close when I was with the FAA. He was also the Director of the AOPA Air Safety Foundation. He is a U.S. Air Force veteran and an airplane owner and a flight instructor, still very active in general aviation. Also today with us is Member Michael Graham. He took the NTSB oath of office at the same time I was taking the reins here at HAI in January of 2020. And he's previously has served in multiple positions at Textron Aviation, Cessna Hawker Beechcraft for 22 years. His most recent position was with Textron, was the Director of Flight Operations, Safety, Security, and Standardization. And he is a veteran U.S. Navy aviator. So we can go ahead and bring up Member Graham, if you would bring up your camera, and we'll let you roll right into this. And apologies for the Bruce Lansberg lookalike.
No problem. I'm just the one with the better haircut. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here to get started. Get the slideshow up there. That looks like it's working pretty good there. So for those of you who don't know what the NTSB's most wanted list is, I'm going to share that with you right now. It's our most wanted list is a list that highlights transportation safety improvements that are needed now to prevent accidents, reduce injuries, and save lives. The recommendations that are on this list have associated safety items that are ripe for action now, and adopting them will save lives. We use this list at the NTSB to focus our advocacy during the current 2-year reign of this most wanted list. So this one's for 2021 and 2022. We urge not just regulators, lawmakers, but the industry, associations, unions, and the traveling public to learn more about what's on the list and help us implement and champion these to save lives in the transportation field. As you see, the two that are related to aviation are on the top of our list there. The first one I'm going to talk about is require and verify the effectiveness of safety management systems in all revenue passenger carrying aviation operations. And then the Vice Chairman, Bruce Lansberg, will come in and talk about installing crash resistant recorders and establishing flight data monitoring programs. So to answer the first question, I would expect, why is SMS on the most wanted list? And we continue to see in our accident investigations, many accidents in the Part 135 and 91 passenger revenue carrying operations have accidents that are preventable. And we've, in our investigation, have highlighted or found out that if the operator had had an SMS, they most likely would have been able to identify the hazard and the risk and mitigate that before having the incident or accident. So that's one of the reasons it's on there. We also have asked for oversight. Many of the accidents we've looked at, especially in just my short time at the board here in the last year and a half, if there was just some simple oversight on part of the FAA, they might have been able to identify for the operator areas of risk and help them eliminate that before an accident would happen. So system basically, it allows an operator to proactively identify and manage its risk. And the way I look at SMS and what SMS is it's not a book on the shelf, or it's not the safety officer down the hall, 2 doors on the right. That's not an SMS. It's a management system that brings safety conscious behavior to the forefront of an organization. It starts at the highest levels and it permeates throughout to all employees every day and with every task. It's a proven management model. You don't even have to have safety in front of it. It's just a management system. To me, it's not what I call soup du jour. It's not the program of the day or the year or the next couple of years. For those who've been around long enough, like myself in aviation, we've probably seen total quality leadership, total quality management, or Six Sigma, or some of those programs. Now this one's around to stay. It's very simple and it's effective. For those that know something about SMS, I'm sure most of you seen the foundation or the 4 pillars of SMS: policy, risk management, safety assurance, and safety promotion. I'm not really going to talk about the definitions or the specifics of each of these, but I'm going to talk about each one in areas that we've seen in our accident investigations where operators have failed to accomplish these tasks in these areas or manage their risk. Or I will also talk about issues that I've seen that are maybe misunderstood within the 4 pillars, and hopefully give you some examples of how you can effectively implement each one of these pillars. And I assume I'm going to probably have some questions on this at the end on these, and please feel free. So let's talk a little bit about safety policy. The most important part of this is not just defining the roles and responsibilities, but it's defining how you do business. Part of that is defining what everybody's role is out there and what their responsibilities are. And one of the most important ones, and actually the 2 most important ones, are the accountable executive and the employee. Both of these need to be defined. And for an SMS to be effective, you need an engaged, accountable executive. Why do I say engaged? We have seen in many of our accident investigations where the owner, the person in charge, the person overseeing the operation, running the operation, they weren't necessarily engaged. They would say, well, I let the pilots take care of that. They need some oversight in the operation. They also need to define the procedures and everybody's role. And just as important is employee engagement. And like I said, say an SMS is not the book on the shelf or the safety officer down the hall. An effective SMS has the employees as the safety officer. Each person in the operation needs to know and understand that they're the safety officer. If they see something, they need to say something, they need to report it. And the flow of communication needs to go both ways between the accountable executive and the employees. If you have good flow of communication, in this case, good safety policy, and everybody understands their roles and responsibilities, then you are promoting a positive safety culture, and you have a good start to an SMS. Also with that, as long as the accountable executive provides the appropriate resources for everybody to do their job effectively, and everybody is honestly trying to do the work as best they can, occasionally unintended consequences may happen. And if the accountable executive steps up and says, hey, I understand this, I gave you everything you needed, and it happened anyways, I've got your back, we need to fix the system, we don't need to punish the person that happens to. So we need to figure out how and why, which is just exactly what we do in our accident investigations, the NTSB, is understand the how and why and fix that. So that's part of the safety policy that may be misunderstood. As we move into safety risk management, one of the areas that I have personally seen in my years in aviation safety that people tend to forget about, and that is change management. I know very few operations out there that are static in what they do. You may do the same thing over and over again, but occasionally you may add a new route, a new operation, a new piece of equipment, a new procedure, a new piece of avionics, and maybe a new aircraft. And anytime you do that, you need to be looking at the risk of that change and mitigating that risk out. And a lot of operators miss on this one at evaluating the risk of something new. It may be high turnover rate and new employees. So you need to look at the risk and then put mitigations in place to take care of that change in the operation. It may be additional training. It may be additional checklist, a change to the checklist. It may be weather restrictions for a while until we get used to the new aircraft or the new operation, or limited to day only, or a height restriction. That's what I'm talking about. And then the other part of that is evaluating that change after you've made it. So if you're not seeing or checking the data to see how that change is affecting the operation, then you're not completing the loop here. And you need to go back and see, are we still having issues? Do we need more training? Maybe that procedure didn't work very well. Maybe we're still having issues with the operation. We need to keep limitations in place for a little while longer and address those. So that's one of the things I see operators coming up short with risk management, is change management. The other part is, how does an operation know what you don't know? And what do I mean by that? In my own operation prior to coming to the board, we were pretty good with all the various flight operations we had as a large GA manufacturer. We were pretty good at about knowing our more risky operations out there. And we put a lot of mitigations in place to take care of those and keep from getting bitten by those. And as we did that, part of what we needed to know was, were those mitigations still working? And one way you know if they're still working is through a good reporting system. Like I said, in a good SMS, every employee is the safety officer. And you should have a good reporting system. One, it needs to be anonymous. So if they don't want to let you know who they are, that's important, as long as we know what's going on out there. The other part of it also needs to be non-punitive. And, don't hammer the messenger here for giving you information on a risk to the operation or a hazard to the operation. So you can evaluate how well you're managing your risk, but you're also going to find out things that you're unaware of out there. Maybe something changed at an airport you go to all the time, and now you start receiving reports on that, or you start getting deviations on a departure procedure or something of that sort. That's where a good reporting system is going to help you out. And with that, I'm aware that HAI is now helping your membership out with the Aviation Safety Action Program, an ASAP. Wonderful program. It's non-punitive, it's anonymous reporting, and I think you'll see over a period of time, it's going to really help your organization really figure out what's going on out there. I know my own operation, when I got it in effect and actually got people comfortable using it, our reporting increased fourfold. And it was good, significant data we were getting out there. With that, and promotion goes with this all together. Once you get reporting in, you investigate it, you mitigate it. You also need to let the employees know what you're doing. And the feedback's important. So de-identified data, de-identified hazards and how they're fixed is very important. The two-way flow. Once people see that, they're going to be more prone to give you more reports. I had a lot of people go, oh, wow, I'm glad you shared that with us because that same thing happened to me last month. I guess I should be reporting it. So you'll find out a lot more about your operation when you get buy-in that way. As we move on to the safety insurance side of the house, let me give you a little unknown secret for many of you out there. For the smaller operators that have you might not have a lot of reporting if you already have reporting in place, or might not get a lot of reporting as you put an SMS in place. How can you benefit, or how can you be proactive with your SMS on your operation? Well, one of the things is if you join the ASAP program, you can also join the ASIAS program, which is the Aviation Safety Information Analysis and Sharing group. And you're able to share your de-identified data with them. And then that'll give you access to aggregate data from everybody who's sharing their de-identified data. So you won't know who it is, but it'll allow you to look at similar operators to yourself. Maybe somebody that uses the same airport as you do, maybe the same type of operations you do, or the same aircraft. And you can go in there and see what kind of reporting is out there and what kind of safety issues are going on. So that's a way of being proactive. Who knows? It might be something you're not even aware of that's a problem with your operation. It might help you also make your pilots aware of this, or your mechanics or whoever else, that there's an issue out there like this. Let's be aware of it so it doesn't happen to us. The other neat thing about this, and I know as we get into safety assurance, I'll be letting the vice chair talk about it a little more, and that's the flight data monitoring. But you can, when I started my program, I started with ASAP. I didn't have FDM yet, but as being part of ASIAS, I could see that aggregated data on FDM operators out there. And I was able to figure out something from that data to make my pilots aware of the safety issues out there with the aircraft we were operating or the places we were operating at. So data sharing is important, and it can help you be proactive in your safety management system. With that, you should always be, looking at your policies and procedures at least every year, your operations with an independent eye. It's not to me, it's not a bad thing to have an audit go on. It's have somebody with who's independent that's going to look at your operation from a different angle, I think is extremely important. And to have that done periodically is very important to seeing where your risks are in your operation and mitigating them. So, and that also, when people see how proactive you are in your organization with safety, it's going to build a positive safety culture, and it's going to promote safety throughout the whole operation. Now, with that, I want to thank you for giving me a few minutes to talk about SMSs. I know we'll talk more about it, but I will now turn this over to the vice chairman, and I will unshare my screen and introduce the vice chairman of the National Transportation Safety Board, Bruce Lansberg.
Thank you, Member Graham. I'm delighted to be here. So we'll get started. And thank you to HAI for having us. We're most appreciative. So we've heard a little bit about the most wanted list, and typical items might cost you $20,000 to replace a piece of equipment. But if you have a crash it's going to cost you a heck of a lot more. And I think one of the big challenges people always ask is, well, where's the cost benefit? Well, we're going to put that in throughout our discussions here. So remember, Graham has spoken about safety management systems, and the flip side of the coin and how you get there, one of the ways is through flight data monitoring. And in monitoring some of the message boards and in personal conversations, we've seen some modestly pushback for the Part 135 and for higher part carrying 91. And let me be clear, we're not talking about the regular Part 91. We're talking where money is changing hands. And the reason for doing this is because to build public trust and safety, and because in the mind of the public, aircraft are aircraft. They're used to the Part 121 standard, the airliners, and so they think, well, if it flies either with fixed wing or rotary wing, it's all the same thing. And of course, we all know that that's quite different. So we have to figure out a way to give them a little bit of confidence there. One of the recurring themes that I've seen, and in party submissions sometimes after a crash, they'll say, we never had a problem. Our operation was absolutely perfect up to this, and it was sort of the see no evil, hear no evil kind of approach. Well, there's another way you could look at it. Accidents are funny things. You don't have them until you're having them, and some people might characterize it a little bit more like this. If you're not looking for things, I mean, what could possibly go wrong? So just briefly, let's count the ways. And here are two frequent, or I should say, crashes that we had not too long ago. Calabasas, that was a Part 135. You'll know it better as the Kobe Bryant crash, where the pilot, the chief pilot of the operation with many thousands of hours flying a Sikorsky S-76, a very capable aircraft, didn't follow all of his training, or any of it for that matter, pulled up into the clouds and lost control of the aircraft. The other one was a Part 91 for hire operation, which was a large-scale sightseeing operation that was working through a loophole in the regulation for aerial photography. And they were taking tourists up and letting them take pictures. And the way they said, we're going to do this is we're taking the doors off the helicopter. Well, one risk mitigation there is it's always a lot of paperwork if somebody falls out and you don't have the same number of passengers coming back as when you went out. So they used construction tethers, which do not have a quick release capability. And the pilots had actually noticed this and discussed it with management and said, we don't think this is a good idea. Well, it went on for a couple of months, and on this particular flight, one of the tethers managed to get wrapped around the aircraft fuel shutoff handle and activated it. And sure enough, the engine stopped. The pilot did a great job, deployed the floats, but unfortunately they didn't deploy evenly. And when the aircraft hit the water, it capsized in about 10 to 15 seconds. The pilot, with a quick release harness, because he wasn't wearing one of these tethers, got out and survived with little to no injury. Unfortunately, all the passengers had drowned. In both cases, these operators had done a lot of flying, and they both had perfect records. So how does FDM help? Well, it gives us an organized method for tracking both the pilot and maintenance activities. And if you think of it, it's a checklist for the organization. We believe strongly in checklists. And in my flying, I use one regularly because my memory isn't what it used to be, and maybe it never was. Here's another thing. People say, well, I really don't want the government snooping around and getting into our business. Well, the government doesn't see any of your records. And quite frankly, we'd much rather see all of you on a social basis as opposed to a professional basis. So the only way we're going to see anything here is after there's an incident. Member Graham has, I think, really carried the point here. This is about compliance. It's not enforcement. And that applies both to the FAA, and I put an asterisk here to say that it also applies to the management of the operation. And if it's a very small operation, we're not talking about a lot of management there, but it is compliance, not enforcement. The whole idea is that we are setting up an ability to trap errors before they result in a bad outcome. So the other thing is, not only do we have flight data monitoring, but it really helps us if we have a crash resistant system. And if something is badly smashed, as you can see here on the screen on the right, or submerged, which doesn't do the electronics any good, or burned, oftentimes there just isn't much left for us to go on. So the crash resistance ability really does help. Now that does increase the cost. We understand that, but it's something to consider. I want you to look, keep the picture that's in the right-hand portion of your screen in mind, because I want to look at a particular crash. This was occurred in Zaleski, Ohio, and it was a Part 135 EMS flight. The conditions you can see over to the right, it was early morning, so still dark. They had snow showers forecasted. Two other operators had declined the flight because it didn't meet their criteria. And obviously, there was no use of night vision goggles, which would have helped the pilot to see the snow showers. Well, we estimated a couple of snow bands were out there that were creating challenges for the pilot. You can see those on the screen. When we go to the radar picture, the picture on the left, the NEXRAD picture, shows that the flight was to the northeast of all depicted precipitation. However, when we dug down a little bit farther, we find that the precipitation, and in fact some fairly heavy precipitation, was detected by the terminal Doppler weather radar near the crash site, and we made a suggestion that that be made available to the pilots. Here you can see a close-up of that particular situation. Well, we were able to track the aircraft up to the point where you see the yellow arrow, and then it disappears because it's below radar coverage, and we had to guess at what happens after that. Now, we had a pretty good idea because where the track was and where the impact point was is where we came out. This is the plot that came off the radar. The green shows the terrain elevation. It's not real high, gets up to about 1,200 feet. And here you can see the flight path of the helicopter, and you can see how the pilot is working to maintain ground contact. And here we see a pretty good descent. And at this point where the black line shows up, we lose all of the tracking ability. Now, we can say, yeah, we have a pretty good idea of what happens, but we don't like to speculate, and it helps us tremendously if the flight data monitoring also happens to be crash resistant. So let's talk a little bit about measuring devices. If you want to see behavior modification in action, all you need to do is put a cop on the side of the road with radar, and you'd be amazed at how the traffic slows down. Of course, we operate with windsocks, so we can take off and land into the wind. That's important to us. Likewise, temperature is critically important, and density altitude as it gets hot. That's going to limit our capabilities to fly. And even the flight instruments that we depend on, all of these things have one thing in common: modifying our behavior to stay within an envelope. And I think that's what's important. That's the psychology, if you will, and the overarching benefit of having measuring devices. And flight data monitoring is nothing more than a measuring device. So we're into the era of big data, FOQA, Flight Operation Quality Assurance. Many of you are familiar with that. But for the smaller aircraft, it doesn't have to be the orange box. I realize for some reason it's called the black box, but I don't buy that. That is clearly orange. You can get a lot of information off of much simpler devices, as you see here. The Part 121 record is excellent for a variety of reasons, but their FOQA system is part of it. This is an important point. We recognize that 135 is not 121, nor is passenger carrying for hire in Part 91. And as Member Graham has mentioned, do we want to be reactive after the fact or proactive? And then it comes down to, well, cost versus safety. And the fact is that low probability, high consequence events are the absolute bane of safety professionals. And so we have to figure out, what's it worth? Well, we can pay a bit up front, or we can pay a lot more after the fact. Does it work? Absolutely. Again, this is Part 121, so that's jumbling the fruit bowl a little bit. But the system does work, and it works well. It doesn't have to be super sophisticated. This was a sample readout that I found on the web that shows where somebody had an excessive bank angle in their flight travels. And so it's called out. And then you can go back and look at the time and say, okay, what was going on here? Let's have a discussion about that. I now want to move into a slightly different area, but it's still part of FDM. And I realize that most of the people this afternoon are flying turbine equipment, but there's still a lot of piston equipment out there. And my phone goes off way too often because we have a fair amount of piston engine failures. On average, about 13 fatalities a month. Not all rotorcraft, in fact, most are fixed wing, but the rotorcraft ones, their percentage of fatalities is perhaps a little higher. And then some of these can be serious injuries or non-injuries. For us, it's our highest area of undetermined cause, somewhere between 35 and 40%. And we're not happy about that, and we're working on trying to get smarter on all of this. But when you've got a lump of molten metal and you don't know what happened, or the thing is spread over 2 acres, it's kind of hard to tell. The incidents, the almosts, we have no idea, nor does the FAA, because unless it meets Part 830 reporting requirements, nobody knows. Let's just get it fixed and we'll go from there. Now, if your piston engine quits over an open area, such as you see on the right, life is pretty good. But if it quits here, or here, or here, the outcome is not going to be nearly so positive. So we need to think about that. Well, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And if you're flying a piston engine aircraft, everybody should be doing oil analysis on every oil change. They should be cutting open the oil filter and looking for bits and pieces of metal. And engine monitors are now remarkably inexpensive. I speak with authority on the topic. My monitor is checking every cylinder every 2 seconds, which is more than I can do. Measures exhaust gas and cylinder head temperatures, and it's downloadable. And this gets to the whole business of the monitoring, and it's retrofittable. This is, again, a fairly easy thing to do. And here you can see from a particular flight not too long ago that I took, all the EGTs are looking good, and the cylinder head temperatures are looking good. And I download those to an analysis operation about once a quarter, and I get a report card, and it tells me, how's my engine doing? Is there something unusual starting to happen along the way? This is not expensive stuff, and it's vitally important to being proactive versus reactive. So we have two sides of the same coin. It doesn't have to be tremendously complicated. And I think we've got some work to do there. The FAA has some work to do there to make sure that we keep it simple. It doesn't have to be tremendously expensive. Again, we've got to look at how this works for the small operator. And when we consider cost versus benefit, if you think being proactive preventing a crash is expensive, you might try having a crash, because oftentimes it puts people out of business, assuming that they survive. My takeaway on all this is SMS, one size most certainly does not fit all. And being ignorant of what's going on with your flight operation, whether it's the pilots or the hardware, is most certainly not bliss. Leave you with a quote here by famous football coach Vince Lombardi. He said it about winning. I'll say it about safety. Safety isn't everything. It's the only thing. So with that, I will turn it back over to Jim, and we can go on from there.
All right, well, we'll have Member Graham come back on, and certainly great to hear both of those presentations. And we're going to get into some questions on that, a little bit of roundtable. And then those that are watching, if you want to send some questions in, we got Chris Hill, the Director of Safety for HII, that'll be helping out. And I think he's going to join us when we get ready for some of those questions. But right off the bat, I wanted to jump on what you were saying there, Vice Chairman Lansberg, on the engine monitors. I fly both airplanes and helicopters. We have yet to fly together, but hopefully one of these days. And in the engine monitor, that a lot. I think some of the stuff on the industry side that we'd like to see is, as and it goes into, well, it's not in my lane, the airplanes and some of the jump planes, where they're right now, they know that they're paying customers. They need a higher level of safety. And so, using some of this technology in the flight data monitoring is certainly the way to help and work together to get that higher level of safety by being able to do the engine monitoring and seeing what's happening versus having to possibly do the teardown. So I think there's some trade-offs we can do, not trading off safety, but actually using technology to the benefit that we can. So I wanted to say, as you presented the two things from the most wanted list, it certainly is a way to highlight areas that need improvement. And as you looked at paying operations where it's that public level of safety, because they don't know, when they walk out to the airport and they think they want to ride, that's some of the things where we also have being challenged with illegal charters. They don't understand that they don't have the oversight and could possibly be it could be operating at a lower level of safety. So I think those are good pushes, and certainly HAI supports both the SMS as well as flight data monitoring, and believes there is improvement in safety in those areas. So thanks for coming on today and presenting that. And those were great slides as well. I think those were two great examples. So has the NTSB participated in any internal investigations where you partnered with other state investigation bodies? And is there something to learn outside of those bodies?
I'm not aware. Mike, do you have any? I mean, obviously, if there's an international investigation, Canada, Mexico, or something like that, we will sometimes have somebody go down. It usually has to be a pretty significant incident for us to send an investigator, but we're constantly looking at what is it that they're finding, because look, aircraft and safety doesn't know international boundaries. It's gravity and human factors are universal. So we're constantly evaluating and looking and learning. So if you're not learning, and this applies to pilots, I'm a 7,000 hour student pilot at this point, which I think makes me the high time student perhaps. But if you're not looking and learning from stuff, you probably ought to give it up.
Anything to add, Member Graham?
Yeah.
I think I tie it back to the data monitoring again, is that if we can find ways to make sure that for the safety methods, and I know Heli Offshore does a great job with their segment of the rotorcraft community of sharing that information. And we're trying to work with things like the vertical aviation safety team now that has expanded the International Helicopter Safety Team so that we can get that information, data that detailed as it can be based on mission sets. And so that people don't have to relearn or, bury their head in the sand and as you were demonstrating and not pay attention because it's only my deal and I didn't have that accident yet. So have you seen any ways to help get the information around the world?
I have not personally seen internationally. I know, like the vice chair was talking about, we end up sending people on probably the more major international accidents, which always seem to be an airline crash, right? But yeah, I haven't heard of any a lot of international sharing. I know some of these programs I think are setting up with some countries. I think Canada is getting on board with the SIAS. So I mean, I highly recommend your membership get on board. I know, do you guys participate in the InfoShare, the FAA InfoShare?
So that we were just kicking off the rotorcraft part of that prior to the the pandemic hitting. So we look forward to get back in with that with the U.S. Helicopter Safety Team. So
yeah. I think that'll be just a really big bonus for your membership to get involved with that. I know I got in kind of on the ground floor with the business and corporate aviation side of the house with that program. And we were just starting to grow pretty large. I wouldn't say as large as the airlines, but the group was growing when I came to the board, and I know everything's really kind of been shut down this last year or so, but I'm really looking forward to, at least I can go watch the InfoShare and not necessarily partake in it, but it's a wonderful program. You're going to learn a lot from other operators out there. And it's so neat to have the doors closed and what goes on in that room stays in that room, and other operators are sharing their hiccups, their issues that they've had, all in the interest that you don't have the same issue happen to you. So I would promote that highly for your organization.
Yeah, and that's what we're trying to do is expand it internationally, taking the lessons from around the
Good
world.
idea.
So your team, I know NTSB is probably a smaller organization. They work long and hard to get these targeted recommendations. How large is the NTSB?
All in, we're about 400, give or take. But those of us in aviation, I think we're a bit myopic because we think that all of NTSB is devoted to aviation. It's not. We cover all the modes. We do highway, we do rail, pipeline, hazardous material, and we do marine. So you get all of that in addition to aviation. Aviation is our largest area. By mandate, we are required to investigate all fatal crashes in aviation, whereas in the other modes, we have a bit more discretion as to, we can kind of assess what the incident was and then decide if we think there's something beneficial that could be learned from it or something like that. But we've got probably about 100 or so people that are dedicated to aviation, but not all of those are accident investigators. You've got the support team, you've got writers and editors and so on. So it's, we keep them pretty busy, and I would say they're probably on average doing 30 or so investigations at least every year on their plate. So it keeps them pretty busy.
So as you work towards that most wanted list, is there a way to just a quick list of how you use the process to get to those recommendations? That's a tough one, huh?
Well, that could be a little sore subject. I mean, this last one that we came up with for this 2 years, we tried to do a more quantitative and qualitative analysis of the data. We tried to be data driven. That's difficult, and I know the vice chair has some comments on this, but if it was all about fatalities out there, probably our most wanted list would be all highway related recommendations, because we lost over 36,000 people this last year on the roads. And
30.
that's a lot, 36,000.
38.
38. Oh, I'm
It's
sorry.
gone
Yeah,
up.
we're up there. Yeah, we've normally been a little above 36. Now we're as what 2020 was.
Yeah.
2020 was.
It's insanity on the roads. And we could go on about that.
Right.
You and I both have some target areas in that, but since we're talking helicopters, we should get back on track, I suppose.
Well, I mean, yeah, some of the things that, again, and I think I'll go into where you're saying, if you didn't have the accident, doesn't mean you're not going to have it. And there's lessons to be learned. And one of the things, we've been trying to do is, lessons learned over the last couple of years and also with the future. I mean, we have rotorcraft right now. We have VTOL aircraft coming in the future. You see some people talking about AAM, the advanced air mobility, and the ability to operate helicopters safer. And you talked about the paid customer getting in there. Well, the advanced air mobility is all about moving passengers. And so right now, that infrastructure in the IFR infrastructure and having helicopters, they're not the same helicopters from the 1950s, 60s, 70s, that they can be IFR equipped and certified. We can get the training of the pilots. And I think I've seen from, while that's not one of your specific things, and I think Bruce and you and I had the conversation about having an IFR flight plan versus a VFR flight plan. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Well, we looked at the Calabasas crash, and this was a totally capable helicopter that could have very easily flown safely in instrument meteorological conditions on an IFR flight plan, and none of this would have happened. And as I recall, we were having a conversation saying that the folks on the East Coast, because they've got more inclement weather, it's more normal for the operators to become IFR qualified and keep their pilots up to date. The West Coast, of course, life is good and everything is easy and so on. And so we try to ignore that and figure most of the time it's going to be okay. Well, if you spend any time around the LA basin, you know that there's going to be fog periodically, and that puts a lot of pressure on the operator. They want to fly, they want to deliver for the customer. I understand that. But how much more would it have been to get their aircraft and their pilots certified so that they could do this? And I think in our investigation, and Mike, correct me if I misspeak, but I think we looked back at the number of flights that the operator had canceled as a result of not being able to go IFR, and thought, if they had gotten that qualification, they would have more than covered the cost of getting the qualification. So, just do it.
Right.
Yeah.
No, absolutely concur. And so we're trying to work on that mindset as well. If the aircraft is capable, and then the other part that I try to help with our members is that, ATC and the air traffic controllers need to get used to talking to you and moving you through that airspace. And we're working with the FAA with Jay Merkel, who came out of procedures, and they're actually using him now as the integration office. And we talk about the advanced air mobility coming in 2025, but I can't do things today, IFR and helicopters. That's not going to work. So we're working on some of those fixes. And I totally agree. It's safer. That IFR structure is a safe structure. Low level routing is capable. So hopefully we can get there too for another increase.
Well, even your background in the military, we discussed that as well, where you were having people scud running and so forth with a considerable risk, as opposed to saying, hey, let's figure this out. Going up is going to be safer than going down.
Yep. So Chris, how are the questions coming in? Why don't you join us on here?
Good afternoon, Jim, Vice Chairman Lansberg, Member Graham. Thank you very much. Yeah, the questions are coming in, so we've got a few we can share with you if you'd like to get right into it.
Let's jump it.
All right. So first one is we're gonna direct to Member Graham, and this is from Tom Benson. Is someone going to give a projected date for 135 operators to have an SMS system implemented? Now, I know we certainly understand that NTSB is in the business of making the recommendations, and in the US, obviously, the FAA is in the business of finding a way to implement those through rulemaking. Jim, you may recall during the December webinar we had with Chairman FAA Administrator Steve Dixon, he indicated this quote, you can see that we're firm believers in the power of SMS. In fact, right now we're targeting the spring of 2022 to publish a proposed SMS rule that will apply to air taxis, some air tour operators, repair stations, and PMA parts providers. We're also working on an SMS for airports as well. So Member Graham, anything to add to that about the process and your satisfaction on how things are moving along?
Well, like anything else with the FAA, it's not going to be quick. We're always hoping for a quicker implementation. What I would tell operators out there, why aren't you doing it now? There are plenty of different certifiable ways of doing this out there that you can go start it up and get started now. That way it's not so painful when it becomes regulatory. I can't tell you when the FAA is going to do it. I know Vice Chairman and I had a meeting with them a few weeks ago, and we were as confused as anybody else on that and how it's going to be scalable and everything else. But the time frame, I don't know. But I would say operators, go out there and do it now. There's plenty of 135 operators, 91 operators that don't carry passengers for hire do it. I know my operation was about 98% Part 91. We had it. We've had it for like 15 years. So there's no reason not to get started now. Get ahead of it, and then when and if it comes regulatory, it won't be as painful to implement.
Well, I'd like to just, what you said earlier during your briefing was that it's a management system. I mean, if you don't have a management system in place to identify those risks and then, check yourself, and then, so implementing it now before, and that's just the US we're talking about. We also are international. So we also are saying that now's the time to implement it because it will make you better. It will make you safer. And then we're looking at the scalable part of what we can help with. And Chris has certainly been, leading in that direction.
Yeah, and that's important. And one of the things we were talking about, we just don't do aviation here, but believe it or not, we recommend to the accidents and crashes in these other modes for these organizations and operators to have a safety management system, whether it's marine or highway or rail. We make the same recommendation to them. It works in all modes.
Yeah,
good management is just management. And if you don't have some kind of a feedback system, I don't care whether it's making widgets or it's flying people. If you don't know what's going on and you don't have a feedback mechanism, you're setting yourself up for problems.
All right, thank you all of you. Great feedback on that. And while we're on the subject, excuse me. There's been lots of discussion about kind of easing into it for an operator who just is learning the acronym SMS today, perhaps, or ones who are just really trying to get started. What's your advice, Member Graham, on how to scale into this in the most logical progression? What's the most important first step you would recommend?
I would say sit down and look at those 4 pillars, and try to just define how you operate and put some policies and procedures down, and then set up a reporting system, very simple, make it anonymous and make it non-punitive, promoting it the whole time, and then just kind of see what you get at that point. And you got to train everybody. That's the first thing. Everybody's got to understand their role and how important it is. And, just open it up and see what you get. There's plenty of applications out there and tools to use that make it very simple, that don't take a lot of effort out there. Some of them cost a few dollars, some cost a lot of dollars, but I think you could do something very simple. We used to do it just with our computer systems and website for a number of years, and now there's plenty of applications. So just start very simple and start looking at those things. And if you don't get any results, try something different. But engage everybody out there, make sure they understand how important their role is, and just see what happens to your culture after that. That's a starting place.
Yeah, and I think, again, just to emphasize what you said is, it's not somebody that you designate to run the SMS program. It's every individual that's part of that company that has input.
Absolutely.
All right, great feedback. So just those of you who are tuning in for the traditional hour-long webinar, just be assured that this one is scheduled in advance to run overtime, because it's not very often we have the honor and the privilege of having members of the board here with us today. So stick around. We still have, basically 100 folks on the line ready to engage and chat with you. And certainly this is your chance to get that information. A few more questions have come in. Let's pivot to FDM and Flight Operations Quality Assurance there, Vice Chairman. There's lots of talk, particularly you'll hear from HAI, about performance-based requirements, meeting the spirit and the intent of the requirement itself. So Bernard Flashman asked the question, can you consider changing the crash-worthy recorders to being the crash-worthy data now? And that data can be retained in the cloud, even if the recording device didn't make it through the accident scenario.
Great point. In fact, I sort of wonder why we even bother with ELTs at this point. And that's an editorial comment. At some point, when we get over to have an opportunity to visit with the FAA, I intend to ask some rather pointed questions in that regard. But no, that's I think, exactly right. The technology is beginning to exist. The biggest challenge, I guess, is the pipe and how often do you have to send stuff up. But I think probably in the next few years, if not sooner, we'll be able to have the ability to shoot stuff into the cloud. And we've misplaced a couple of airliners for a period of time after a crash, and it took a long time to find them because they were underwater and so on. Whereas if you had this ability, it would be great. And as far as we're concerned, as long as we get the data, we don't care whether it's residing in the cloud. In fact, we'd probably be much happier to get it there rather than having to pick through. I showed you some pretty graphic pictures this afternoon. If we don't have to do that, we'd be thrilled.
Yeah, you bring up a good point there. Some of those airliners, they were actually transmitting their engine trend monitoring data the whole time. Unfortunately, they just didn't have the location being transmitted.
Minor detail.
Yeah.
Well, that brings up a good follow-up regarding confidence, trust, protection of data, that sort of thing. So there's a couple questions on that point. Let's hit the first one from an anonymous attendee who says, what suggestions do you have for pilots who bring safety concerns to management, but there isn't much of a response? As an individual pilot, what actions can this person take? Member Graham, you wanted to hit that first?
Whoa, that's a tough one. Yeah, I hope that doesn't happen as much as it used to. I'm quite aware of that, but it's one of those, I've always believed in the chain of command. I started in the Navy, and you start working your way up, and if nobody's doing anything and it's significant enough, the hazard you're talking about, go up the chain. I can't believe, people aren't going to act upon a significant risk. One of the things with that, I had people come in quite a bit with issues as a former safety director. Sometimes it wasn't necessarily a safety issue. And you got to be kind to that person when they come in, and then maybe you need to tell them you need to address that with your chief pilot or scheduling or something like that. But if it's a true safety issue, I hope they act upon it. And unfortunately, I've seen these operations out there too. If nobody wants to react to anything and it's a significant safety issue, maybe it's time you start looking to go work somewhere else. Unfortunately, I've had to tell a few pilots that, hey, if it's really that bad, do you really want to try to stay on there? If you bring up a point and say, hey, this is a safety issue, I'm not comfortable with this, and they want to continue to push you, there's a point where you've got to be able to say, no, I'm not comfortable, I'm not going to take it. But you also got to understand the consequences too. You might be out of a job for a while, but you're probably better off going to another operator if it's that bad.
You might also still be alive. We saw in the Fly Nyon case, it was a clear breakdown. The director of safety resigned. A new director came on board, and unfortunately, the upper management was running the operation and basically telling them, and the pilots had brought it up. about the construction tethers and said, these are not safe. We shouldn't be using them. And they were ignored. So as Member Graham has said here, now you know the color of their stripes. Maybe it's time to start thinking about something else. And that is much, much easier said than done. Well, I will acknowledge that.
Yeah, the point about establishing trust in a reporting system there, Member Graham, that's a very good point. I remember one of my early SMS courses I took many years ago, the instructor emphasized to the class that when you're starting a program, it doesn't matter if it's a safety concern or not. Go out of your way to be responsive to those complaints, those nuisance things that people are reporting. Establish trust, let people know you're listening, and then you'll get through that nuisance period where people are actually then starting to provide more quality reports about the real safety concerns that are out there. So that's a good feedback item. Another one coming in from Bill McGregor from the New Zealand Helicopter Association. Thanks for tuning in today, Bill. How do you protect flight data from being used for punitive versus safety purposes? And what they have some issues, like some other places around the world, they're having trouble getting some of this type of information into the non-punitive category. So what are some of the advice you might offer to some of those entities out there trying to make that progress?
I would say it's, I know in the US alone, the ASAP and the FOQA programs are a protected legal document, and they're not foiable. And that's all part of the training. And it's a legal document between the operator and the FAA. And that data cannot be shared with anybody else. And you can share it with the SIAS, and it's treated the exact same way. It's de-identified, and it can't be used for litigation, and it can't be foiable. So that's in the US. I can't speak for outside the US, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think I'll add to that is that, and may not be the intent of that question, but the other part is right now, you know, and I know we've got operators that have the satellite-based flight following. They can do it up to, you know, every 15 seconds. And essentially they use it for training. When their pilots are not operating within the parameters that they set that they want to see them operate, they won't take punitive action, but they will take retraining to make sure that the pilots understand what the standards are and that they're exceeding them. And there should be that type of culture where it's not one strike and you're out, but, you know, hey, Big Brother could be looking at you. We're getting to that point. The flight data monitoring to being used by an employer to ensure that his equipment is going to last. So there are some of those concerns, and that's, I think, goes back to the culture you were talking about, remember, Graham, that you got to trust your boss. And if your boss has the wrong set of colors, then we need to move on, find somebody that has the culture to work in.
Absolutely. I understand that completely. And yeah, you have to build that trust before you build that program, or it's not going to work.
One other thing we've liked to bring forward is we've asked for video or in-cockpit image monitoring. And there's been quite a bit of concern about, well, this is going to make its way onto television. And the reality is that what we've requested will be treated exactly the way CVR is, and that is a transcript will be published, but the actual raw data will not. And people say, well, I see these recordings all the time. Well, the challenge is that those are over the air kinds of things. So that's already in the public domain. The intra-cockpit activity is not, and we have never had an unauthorized release of our activity, and the same thing would apply to video in the event that something like this happened.
Yeah, thanks for that. I also would like to point out HAI is currently working with NGFT, a Swiss-based company, to develop a FRAT program that also includes capabilities of a safety reporting system. And this system is based on the foundation built by requirements from the Swiss government, which is highly protective of data and information, as we all well know. So if you don't have the ability to enroll in the FAA's ASAP program, there are other programs out there that will protect the information provided within that commercial application. So do some research, find out about that. If you want to take a look at that, you can go to HAI/FRAT and you can get a little bit of data information there. Certainly there are other options, but take a look around. If you don't have the US option available, there's others available to you. All right, moving on to the next question. This one kind of has relevance to my past life at working in Coast Guard DHS, working with public service operators, police, public safety. How involved have you gotten with some of those types of accidents? I know based on my experience, we had our own investigative bodies, and it was pretty rare that the NTSB would roll with us. But in the instance where another civil aircraft is involved, my understanding is your rules would in fact have an NTSB serving as the lead in some of those cases, if not a partner in that. Would you like to describe that a little bit, Vice Chair Lansberg?
You've described it exactly right. If it's within just military assets, we pretty much leave it to the military. But once you cross the line and get into impact on civilian activities or aircraft, then they don't get the opportunity of investigating themselves. So we've had a couple of investigations. This involved the Navy and a couple of destroyers that collided with commercial shipping, and we were the lead on that investigation to help the Navy to see the error of their ways and go forward. So the same thing applies in aviation as well.
Yeah, and not just to be clear, police operations, municipal operations that are operating under, their normal operational authority, they still get investigated with NTSB. You have famous events like Alaska State Trooper, which is a case study for many folks up in, for the inadvertent IMC type thing. There's plenty of other events that have happened that are, things that you study right there at your facility in Chantilly, is my understanding. So let's talk a little bit about that. How are things going as the pandemic is starting to, we're starting to see some light at the end of the tunnel? How about your training programs you have there, your world-class training that you offer? Do you see some future ahead where you can get back running?
Yeah, I think we do. Obviously, as a government agency, we follow the lead from the government, and so I am optimistic that we will be getting back to normal here in the not too distant future. Now, how you define that? Can I say it's going to be the end of July? I can't tell you that. The powers that be will make that decision, but it is our belief that we will be getting back and offering the courses again live.
Well, for those who aren't aware, the NTSB has a whole suite of great training courses that they offer, and some of the world's leading investigators take the same training out there, and then they turn around and offer it to us in the commercial industry. So I recommend you reach out to them, find out what's available, and when you can schedule something. So a little plug for you guys who do some great work in that area. So moving on, let's talk about inadvertent IMC a little bit. So we've had a few comments, not necessarily questions, a couple of questions, Richard Gallagher among others, asking this question: why do pilots continue to attempt to make the 180-degree death turn? Whether they're rotorcraft or fixed wing, that's become less of an automatic spring-loaded response. I would acknowledge that the rotorcraft flight handbook doesn't even include that as the first step. That does, we do talk about turning around while you still have legitimate visibility, but just a real quick plug for the 56 seconds to live training program that we've put out there, and we advise everybody to take a look at that. If you haven't, just Google 56 seconds to live and you'll get right to it. But Vice Chair Lansberg, you're both of you, offer your thoughts on the evolution of the thinking on inadvertent IMC and the corrective actions for not only fixed wing, but rotorcraft pilots. Any thoughts?
Well, for my entire career, back to the time when I had hair, I realize it's not popular with this crowd, but we've had this IMC problem. And the question that I ask is, what part of cloud don't you understand? And it's bad in airplanes. It's worse in helicopters, particularly if you're not trained. And the usual thing about, well, helicopters are stable, or excuse me, airplanes are stable, helicopters are not. You have to take into account, okay, if it's starting to look bad, now we need to think about something. Now, helicopters have a huge benefit over fixed wing, though, and that is that if you can find any open area, you can land. And as we looked at the Calabasas crash, we were scratching our heads and saying, here's this pilot who has been trained to do all of this. And the idea is, in fact, he could have turned around very easily when it was very clear that going forward wasn't going to work, and go back to Van Nuys, put them on an Uber. Yeah, they're going to be a little bit late, but they're going to get there and everything's going to be fine. And instead, just tried to plow on through. And that gets us into the human factors of optimism bias, i.e., it won't happen to me. The non-existent invisible shield that all of us think we have protecting us. No, you have to have a little bit of imagination and say, okay, how far do I pull a string out before I turn around and say, no, I've got to do something differently.
Right.
Jim, what are your thoughts?
No, well, right off the bat, the Land and Live program that Matt Zuccaro, worked with me when I was in the FAA at the time was right there, especially when he was in that particular accident, when he was in the holding pattern, trying to just, talk to somebody. There's plenty of time to land and live. And in helicopters, it's the minute that you start slowing down or going down, that's trigger. You're, hey, wait a second. Why am I slowing down? Why am I going down? And because you're going to outfly your eyeballs. You don't want to do that. You want to, and if you have the capable aircraft, and now they do, with an autopilot to assist or a second pilot, just use the equipment on board, use the technology, go IFR, go safe, get above the terrain. So there's too many options to be still plowing into clouds.
Absolutely. I don't understand the mindset of continuing to flirt with weather when you don't have a capable craft to go into it, or you're not capable of doing it, or even current. And in the case of the Calabasas we talked about, the pilot had a lot of time, had instrument training. Unfortunately, we believe he only had 7 actual instrument hours in his whole career, which is not enough. And if you continue to flirt with it, it's going to bite you sooner or later. So if you're not ready for it, you're not trained for it, there's no reason to even get close to it in my book.
Yeah, it's time and time again, we hear about, everybody preaches and believes and says they're going to do exactly what we've all just said here. And then they have an important event, a super important mission, and they find a reason to justify and rationalize themselves out of it. Jim, you were on a recent pretty important flight in the DC area, ushering in a whole fleet of aircraft that was coming into the area, and then weather became an issue. Can you describe what happened there and the tough decision you had to make?
Oh, you're talking about they're doing the said it would have been the 75th anniversary for World War II, and so they had some aircraft that were set up to fly, and I went out as a weather bird in my airplane. So I actually filed IFR, got out of Gaithersburg, went out to look to see if it was VFR to do it. It was certainly the best ATC handling I got in a long time, because I flew the route. And I was basically the weather bird, but I was on an IFR clearance in an IFR capable aircraft. And, and then I had to shoot an approach back into Frederick because Gaithersburg had actually got so low. So if you got a capable aircraft and you're ready for it, it wasn't an issue. And all those aircraft did not fly that day because it just wasn't there. And so you have to have the minimums, and that's what gets into personal minimums. You shouldn't be going special VFR in an aircraft that isn't equipped and capable to go IFR. You're flirting when you're special VFR. Even half a mile clear of clouds is what a helicopter can do, and that should be for a mission helicopter doing mission at a mission site, and not transporting 135. So that's where I've talked to the members of the board here that I don't like to hear people talk about helicopters and the equipment of helicopters, because you got to talk about the mission set that helicopter is performing. And certainly, again, as we get into the future with VTOL aircraft, what is the mission we're doing with the aircraft? What are the qualifications of the pilot who's operating that aircraft, whether he's in it or not?
Yeah, so Vice Chair Lansberg, you mentioned the word human factors a moment ago, and it's clear that the board and the investigative teams are getting a little bit more understanding and willing to go there talking about human factors and in the entire accident causal chain, even supervisory and organizational factors. Quite a move away from just pure pilot error of the old days. Some people might say in one of your recent accident investigations where you focused on safety culture that the pendulum might have swung too far in that direction. What would you say to that? And what are your plans to continue focusing on human factors across the entire causal chain in future accident investigations?
Well, I mean, I would even ask Bruce if you'd expand that to all the modes of transportation, because you're probably doing a lot of work there.
I think you can start an argument amongst any group, and the board is no different in that regard. Sometimes you get to see it played out, and sometimes it's not. But you know where you draw the line, and what we've been talking about here, this whole business of having a system to trap errors and a way to trap errors, which is what flight data monitoring does on the hardware side of things. You start to see problems and you're catching them before they get to the end state of single point failure. And in my prior life, which scares all my friends, I used to work with nuclear weapons. And people, yeah, I was all of 23 years old when that happened, but be that as it may, you know, oops was not in the vocabulary, and we had a whole system set up so that even if I screwed up, we weren't going to have a major problem. And so that's the whole idea behind saying, well, we've got multiple layers and you try to avoid the single point failure. Sometimes you get to the point where you did everything correctly and something didn't work out and the last link in the chain broke. And then our job is to look at probable cause, but usually, not always, but in most of the cases, and Mike, jump in here, in most of the cases, there was a foundation that was not well laid, which then kind of got this pilot to thinking, oh, I can make this work, as opposed to saying, wait a minute, if I got to explain this, this is not going to go well. And we've had discussions about this. I'm just going to land.
No, that's a good point. You know, when we talk about our investigations, we just make it very simple. When we come in, we show up at a scene, we look at the man, the machine, and the environment, right? And human factors are a big part of this. And one of those, the environment's not just the weather, right? It's the operating environment. And that's the operating environment within the operation. And we look very closely at that. So you will see things about safe. Everybody has a safety culture in every operation. It may be positive, it may be negative. As a matter of fact, one of those that we did not too long ago, we actually said it was toxic. So operating environment is important. And I think you'll continue to see that coming from the board in our probable causes.
And that will be across the modes, because transportation, regardless of how the problem occurs, there's a lot of similarities.
Excellent. So that's great news. So, you know, we're drawing to the end of the hour. We still have the better part of our original attendees here today. I'll ask you, Member Graham, you're one of the newer members of the board. If I recall correctly, former F-18 driver, is that correct?
Yep, F-18s and A-7s.
So what from that fighter pilot background gave you the bug to go into the safety route and ultimately land on the board? Can you explain that a little bit?
Well, that's kind of, yeah, it's kind of funny. Actually, in the Navy, especially in a single seat squadron, you have a lot of other jobs. You know, you may be a division officer of power plants or avionics armament or the line division or operations. So one of the jobs I got fairly early on was into the aviation safety office, and it just kind of expanded on that. I did a lot of work with the training. When I got out of the Navy, I got pretty heavily into aviation safety at Cessna originally. We eventually bought out Beechcraft, Textron Aviation, and just got heavily involved with that and the different programs out there with ASAP and the industry with the business and National Business Aviation Association, the Air Charter Safety Foundation. And so safety kind of found me. I didn't necessarily find it, but I got very involved with it. I enjoyed it. I got passionate about it. And a number of years ago, I was at a safety conference, and there's our chairman, Robert Sumwalt, and he's talking about the board. And that night we were at a networking reception, and Robert had been talking about there being some vacancies in the board, and we were just going around the room talking to each other in the group and saying, oh, I couldn't go do that. I couldn't go do that. And I sat there and went, you know what? I think I could do that job. Matter of fact, I think I'd really like that job. So I started pursuing it, a few recommendations, and a few years later, I'm here. So it's been a great, it's a good top off to an aviation safety career.
Well, thanks for that. We appreciate you sharing that, and congratulations. And we look forward to many, many good years with you on the board, working with us and the rest of the industry. Vice Chair Lansberg, you've been there for a little while. The changing of the guard is happening. Anything that you can predict? Any new directions or areas of focus that you can share with us?
My crystal ball is typically as muddy as it always is. So I think you can look forward to certainly some areas of continuity and some areas of change. So we'll say partly sunny to partly cloudy or whatever. But no, I think Chairman Sumwalt has been a great leader for us. He's been there for almost 15 years, and so he's really an institution. But Member Homendy comes from a very good background, and unlike Mike and me, I mean, she knows railroads and pipelines and hazardous materials. So we need to have that that diversity there. So I think I think it's all going to be good.
All right. Well, I think we're going to draw to a close here in a moment. I give each of you an opportunity for some parting thoughts, and if you would be willing to share. You talked a lot about, safety enhancements, SMS, FDM. As our viewers are looking with limited resources, what's the best use of their resources? What thoughts do you want to leave them on where they could focus their energy right out the gate, just to get something started? Vice Chair Landsberg, I'll start with you.
Well, I think first off, training continues to be important, and investing good money in regular, realistic training. I'm a big fan of simulators, having come from a simulator organization. And I think you can do an awful lot in simulators that you can't safely do in the aircraft. But there are some things that can be done safely in the aircraft. I'm a firm believer in the flight data monitoring, even at a very basic level, as Jim and I have talked about with engines that we use on our aircraft. And so it's a way to get your toe in it, and then just think about, hey, bad things don't always happen to other people. Let's be proactive and start looking for things and coming up with an organized way of doing it. And, put your toe in the water. I think you'll find, it works pretty well, and it'll work for you.
Thank you for that. Member Graham?
Yeah, I just want to echo what the vice chairman said. The training is a huge part of it, and I do believe in simulator training. There isn't a better way to put worst case scenarios at a pilot and have them train and practice it than in a simulator. So we always train for the worst case, train for the worst and hope for the best, right? So training is a huge issue, and you expect the unexpected, and what I like to say is respect the unexpected, manage your risk. What are you doing out there? What are you constantly looking for the risk in your operation? So do those few things, and I think you'll be on the right step forward.
All right, thank you very much, Jim. Final thoughts from you?
Yeah, I think, it's great to have both the vice chairman on board as well as Member Graham. I think the topics, again, SMS management system, and then having data that you can actually analyze and have the feedback loop of, are you doing what you're trying to do out there? So both very good. And then as an association, of course, Chris, the stuff that we're working on is how do we help our members not have to do it themselves, that we can provide programs that get at these recommendations. And then that's why I was just wondering, and I know you work well with industry. Would you, I mean, if all of a sudden I came to you and said, holy cow, I've got the whole helicopter community is got an SMS program and they're doing flight data monitoring, would that help the FAA get over and get one of your recommendations closed because industry took it on and did it themselves? Just a thought. You don't have to answer, but I was just, that's the point of your top 10, is that show industry, hey, you don't have to wait on the government, or you don't have to wait on your regulator around the world. These are good practices. What's that?
We would absolutely endorse that. So go forward.
All right. Yeah. So, these are professionals. You're the hard team that put these together. It doesn't only stay inside the boundaries of the United States, as we talked about earlier. So international people that are on today, these are going to be best practices that to help make the whole community safer. So thank you very much, Vice Chairman Lansberg. Thank you very much, Member Graham. And I appreciate your time today. It's outstanding to get 2 board members here for an hour and a half. So thank you.
Thank you. It was our pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
Turn it over to Dan.
Yes, and I'd like to extend my gratitude to Vice Chairman Landsberg and Member Graham as well. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Your time has been invaluable. I'm sorry that we were limited to just 90 minutes because I think the conversations can continue. Ideally, we'd love to have you back in the future to continue these conversations and to see how the recommendations are progressing. It is now time to wrap up a few things. So let me bring up my computer screen here real quick. Save the date. Next week's webinar. As always, our webinars are every Thursday afternoon at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, Universal Time Code -4. Next week is Fly Neighborly training with the latest Robinson R44 noise abatement guidance. And this is going to be the first in a series of aircraft specific or model specific or airframe specific guidance for Fly Neighborly. We want to help you fly more neighborly and reduce the number of noise complaints that these aircraft are receiving. This will be continuing throughout the coming year and quite possibly into the future because there's a lot of aircraft out there. And so we look forward to that series. By the way, this information, just because you don't have an R44 doesn't mean that the techniques may not apply to you. So please tune in, please be willing to share the video as always. We do ask that you provide us feedback on these webinars. We do pay attention to the information you send into us. We are grateful for it. We use a lot of your suggestions for topics for future webinars. There will be a questionnaire coming shortly. It's not very long. We do ask that you take just a couple of minutes to share your thoughts with us. And as always, if you have any opinions on how HAI can improve our services to you, please let us know that as well. The easiest way to take care of that is to send Jim Viola an email directly, president@rotor.org. He does see every email. He does assign those emails to our staff for tasking. That does wrap up our webinar for today. We are grateful that you took the time to join us as always. And until next week, we ask that you be safe and you fly safe, and we'll see you again very soon.